All right. Well, thanks again for hopping on the podcast. And yeah, I like I said, I'm excited to talk to you today, and we have a lot to get into. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, we do. It's going to be fun.
So I thought a good place to start would be Clubhouse, because I was going through your Twitter to prepare for this interview, and I saw that you had recently tweeted yesterday about the app Clubhouse, which I actually downloaded a couple weeks ago, and then recently got invited to it because it's exclusive invite only. And I wanted to get your thoughts on it. What do you think of the platform? First impressions, things like that. Just in the moment, what did you think when you were going through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very novel and interesting, and it's like refreshing to see that even though we think social media has been like static and hard to innovate in, we see new stuff come around that I think technologically still would have been possible a few years ago. And I think that's an interesting place to start. I mean, huge kudos to the Clubhouse team because it's not easy to like scale something this quick, this hot.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of buzz like back in April and just had to put a ton of work in while people were busy copying their app and their idea and launching competitors and like Twitter's coming out with stuff and like it's really hard I think to keep focus and discipline on like making a really well crafted product, which I think Clubhouse is for certainly how old they are, and then just like keep that going until they opened up the invite stream
Yeah,
just last month or two.
it's weird because every time a new social media app gets released, especially as someone who's regularly releasing podcasts, I always feel like I have to be on the next new thing, whether it's Clubhouse or IG Reels or TikTok or whatever. And when I was going through it, I actually really enjoyed the whole setup because there's no video on the app. You're going into these clubhouses, these rooms, and hearing people speak, and you can raise your hand and talk to someone who's super well known. It could be a super famous person like an athlete or something like that, or it could be someone who's a smaller creator. And so I love that dynamic of it seems like kind of this almost equalizing of voices where you can just start your own thing. And if people feel like listening to you, almost like podcasts, you can start your own chat or just raise your hand and talk to someone you're interested in.
Yeah, it is a cool. It's all frictionless, bespoke, one-time only podcast. It is a very interesting evolution, and I'm curious to see where it goes. Where it goes and where it stabilizes. Like, what are the things that people use it for in the future? Does it become like a 3 or 4 person phone call? Is it more of like a small group, like group chat use case, or is it better actually that it's like large scale broadcast stuff? Is it something in the middle? Like I think all of that is stuff that each social network and each medium has like its own kind of point of stasis for those and its own like patterns that it settles into. And this is just so new that we don't exactly know what that's going to look like yet, and it's exciting.
Have you been part of any exciting conversations on Clubhouse yet? Because I actually haven't listened to a formal chat. I've dug around on the app, but I haven't actually sat in on someone speaking yet.
Oh yeah, I mean it's exciting. A lot of the conversations feel exciting because they're kind of like just disappearing, like
Yeah.
and the quality does not seem. It's hard to beat the quality of a well curated, like well edited podcast, right? Like it is not going to be better
Hmm.
necessarily, but it's different and it's special in that it's kind of expiring quickly, and that you never know where it's going to go. So I've heard some very like interesting things, and it's cool to hear Mark Andreessen and like I think the surprise ones are the best. Like,
Yeah.
Scooter Braun, like Justin Bieber's managers, like pops into one randomly, or Oprah or whatever. You're just kind of
Yeah.
like, oh, holy smokes! Like, I wasn't ready for that. And it's thrilling. Like, it's exciting to see it come up, but it's also like it's rarely the best version of that person. But
Hmm.
it's fresh and exciting.
Yeah. I like how you can invite or may not be in the same field as you. I was listening to Tim Dillon talk on his podcast. He's a stand-up comedian, and he was super into the whole thing that just happened with Wall Street bets and is still happening with um, Robinhood and GameStop, AMC, all that stuff. And he was invited in on this investing chat as a stand-up comedian, and he was, you know, dropping jokes every 4 or 5 minutes. At least that's what he said, because he's like, my job is to be funny, so I have to make people laugh somehow. But at the same time, it's this guy whose job is to make people laugh, and then he's also super deep into this whole seems like a shift in investing, maybe something at the start, and for it to be on an app like Clubhouse, where you would think, oh, I'm not going to take this seriously. This is like maybe a kids app or something, but like these super deep intellectual conversations are happening with people across silos, like across industries, is cool.
Yeah, I think you're going to see like crazy stuff like that, and like just things that you would never have choreographed, but they just kind of happen organically, and that's super fun. And you're just going to see some super weird stuff. I got a push notification the other day, or maybe I saw a screenshot on Twitter. There's like this woman was like live clubhousing her. She was like, I'm in labor
Jesus.
and I'm having contractions and I'm about to give birth. Like, so I'm going live on Clubhouse.
God
and you're
damn.
like, there you go. We're going to see some weird
Well,
stuff. For sure.
I hope that worked out for her. Maybe Tim Dillon can jump on to the next labor Clubhouse stream, so he can provide some comedic commentary.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't listen to the stream, but I can't imagine that a comedian would not have helped
So
in some way.
I wanted to get into the almanac of Naval Ravikant, which is right here. I'm gonna try to point it at the right camera because I have the one on my laptop also. So for people who may not be familiar with the almanac of Naval Ravikant and the process behind writing the book and what got you into Naval in the first place, would you be able to explain who is Naval to you? Who was your entrance? What was your entrance to Naval, and what made you want to spend the last 3 years of your life curating and compiling this resource that is the Naval Almanac?
Yeah. Naval, never heard of him.
Me neither.
I don't know. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I heard about Naval first back in like 2011. And I was like in school, and really wanted to get into the startup world and was trying to figure out how to kind of break into the Valley and move to San Francisco and get into the startup culture. And somebody told me, go read all of Paul Graham and go read all of Venture Hacks, which was written by Nivi and Naval. It's a great blog, still up. There's a bunch of great stuff. They were blogging about kind of like the game theory of venture capital, how to raise money and what different terms mean, and breaking down term sheets, and how they were building their company, which turned into AngelList. But I just saw that I really enjoyed that, and I've followed Naval, for the last 10 years as kind of grown from that. And so at first it was a lot of like startup building, and then it was a lot of startup investing, and then kind of turned into more like principles, and in the past few years it's become more like philosophical. Definitely, I mean, a lot of stuff about crypto and the future of education. So each sort of like sedimentary layer that Naval has like put out over the last decade of like things he's gotten interested in have been interesting to me, and I've kind of followed along on. And then a few years ago he did a podcast with Shane Parrish on the Knowledge Project that I thought was just an awesome episode, and I learned a ton from it. I had listened to it a few times. I sent it to people, and it just struck me that like Naval had created so much wisdom and so much value on these really ephemeral platforms. They were in podcasts, they were in Twitter, and they were kind of like, they're not super searchable, they're not super accessible, they're a little bit going to be lost to time if they don't become a more permanent format like a book, something that's been around for thousands of years that people know how to buy and gift and read, and that everybody kind of knows what to do with a gift or with a book, and regardless of your like, what your media consumption habits are. Like most people pick up a book every now and then. So I wanted to just kind of help this information, this wisdom, make it to a new medium, and so that was just an idea that I kind of put out into the universe, and by sharing it on my Twitter and a whole thousands of people were
Mhm.
like, yes, please do that. We want that. And so I got to work, and a few years later, we got a published book out of it, and here we
It
are.
seems like for you to dedicate 3 years of your life to going through transcripts and different interviews, podcasts, over 20,000 tweets, you would have to see somewhat of a reflection in yourself in that person to be able to do that. Because for me, a lot of the projects I'm most passionate about, whether it's with something or someone, it's it's hard to dedicate a lot of time to that thing unless I see something of myself that I either am or I want to be. Because there are a lot of investors out there, there are a lot of smart
Hmm.
people. For you, what was it that you may have seen in Evolve that made you think of something in yourself, or just kind of like spark that interest at a deeper level beyond all the other people out there who are also smart and great investors? What was it to you that made you want to get into Naval at that deep level?
Yeah, I think Naval for me brings together and embodies like a few different interests for me that are like it's just hard to see them come together. And so I grew up in the Midwest, very like kind of fundamental business education, like small business house. Grew up reading, Munger and Buffett, and like Poor Charlie's Almanac is one of my favorite books, and I love reading about and learning, mental models and stuff like that. But I'm also very into like, I've been reading sci-fi since I was a kid, and like wanted to get into startups and love thinking about it and living in the future. And I'd rather kind of think about where technology is going than optimize like an
Yeah.
insurance business. And so Naval kind of like brings together some of the like big fundamental like cross disciplinary thinking that I really appreciate about like Charlie Munger, and applies it to startups and technology and futurism and education, and is not so, especially the past few years has become like more philosophical and more kind of like
Mhm.
almost well-rounded, I guess. Is it's not just like a shallow kind of take on like, here's how you solve this problem, or here's how
Mhm.
you get rich, or here's the, like the most efficient way to make money. It's not like
Yeah.
hustle porn kind of stuff. It's very like, let's look at the long arc of history and the long arc of technology and understand how to like live at the frontier and change and improve the human condition and make money doing it, because capitalism's our system and it's a beautiful thing, but like nothing is beyond questioning or stepping back from or taking apart. And Naval does a great job of like poking at all that
Mhm.
stuff and having a fun time doing
Yeah.
it, I think.
All right. So where were we? Um, one of the things, one of the things I wanted to ask you. I'm laughing because we had a technical difficulty and we are back now. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is it goes off a quote that you mentioned in a previous interview, and it was a quote by Peter Kaufman, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quote, but it was, if you saw a child at 7 and they didn't change between the ages of 7 and 10, that would be tragic. But if you saw someone that was 27 and didn't change until they were 30, nothing would be wrong. That's just like a normal thing in society. So I was wondering for you, how have you changed in the past 3 years writing this book the most? And what are the ways that you think you've changed the most writing the Naval Almanac?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I like that quote a lot. I think that we are all like subtly discouraged from changing and growing, actually, like by the people around us
Hmm.
sometimes, unintentionally. Is just like a thing that happens like almost subconsciously. And so like when you undertake a project like this, you never exactly know like where it's going to go and how you're going to change and what it's going to be. But you know that if you go the distance, like something will be different on the other side. And I think there's something inherently like valuable in overcoming a challenge or a goal, especially like over a long term thing like that. Whether it's you know you want to literally go climb a mountain, or you want to, you know, accomplish some physical feat. You want to, you know, squat 400 pounds or something, like whatever a challenge is, as long as it takes like somewhere north of 1,000 hours and at least a year to accomplish, like that's, you are different on the other side of that challenge. And so there's certainly like all of the things that I learned doing this like giant conceptual jigsaw puzzle, and like putting so much of my attention and energy into Naval's learnings and lessons. And I feel like I can now like have a pretty fluent conversation with his principles and like my mental model of what he would think about things, which is a super interesting and valuable thing. But I also think that there's like, you know, I'm just excited and gratified at finishing to what I think is like a high bar of quality, a project that I worked on for, you know, for many years. Just like I'm sure you're proud of, you know, having put out so many podcast episodes and like the growth of an audience and things like that. It's very gratifying, and there's like intangibles that are you gain from that, no matter what the project is.
Can you talk about a little bit of that Naval on your shoulder? You mentioned like having the mindset of Naval ingrained into you, because it seems like having someone on your shoulder would be, you know, kind of making not making decisions for you, but having someone so deeply ingrained in your thought process, like Naval, having done research on him and read so many of his words and listened to so many of his interviews over the past 3 years, it seems like that would come into your decision making on a daily basis. Are there any sort of specific instances where you may have acted one way or done something and you consulted those principles, you consulted that little Naval, and you sensed that maybe you should go in another direction, or you should explore something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, there's tens of examples for sure. Like it's been a lot, and I'm almost like, there's some that feel like consulting the principles, and there's some that's just like, those are now my principles, and I feel like almost guilty at how I've like subsumed them into my own like operating system.
Why do you feel guilty about it?
I think, I think there's a sense of like, we could, if we wanted to properly attribute like the source of every thought or quote or idea that we had, like we could just be quoting the place that we found the ideas all the time. And part of me is like, just very aware that everything that I've learned from, you know, my parents or Naval or Charlie Munger or whatever. But it's also like obnoxious to attribute the source of every like every thought that you have to like the book or whatever that you read.
Footnotes to everything that you say. I would do the same thing. I feel like everything that I say is, if I went back to the root of where that idea or thought came from, it's unoriginal because it's from someone else. And so even the ideas that I think are original, if I dug back far enough, I would find someone else, you know, maybe 10 or 20 or 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that thought the same thing and implanted it somehow through, and maybe it went through hundreds of other people's content, and I read it from someone else and I attributed it to that person, but in reality it came from the people before him, or her. So yeah, it's kind of like a clusterfuck of unoriginal / original thoughts of people wanting to take credit / not taking credit / feeling guilty about it. So I don't know how to feel about it either.
Yeah, it's this paradox of like, you know, it is really easy to string together like a completely unique sentence. You know, like we say unique things for the first time all the time. But over the long arc of history and like all of these different, like there's so little that's actually new fundamentally. But yeah, well, you know, you never want to like take credit for other people's insights and work and effort, but you're also like, everything came from somebody else eventually, even for all of those people, right? Like we're all just kind of information processing machines that we're trying to kind of do our best to like understand it for ourselves and help the people around us. And that's just like the form that it takes.
Yeah. So going back to the Naval metaphor, the mini Naval on your shoulder, do you ever feel like there are instances where that's a negative? And I've actually been thinking about this a lot recently, and I recorded a small podcast on it on another podcast that I host where I mentioned before I kind of riff on these 10 15 minute segments of certain subjects, and I called it "Stop Seeking the Approval of Your Heroes," because I feel like for some of the people that have been a Naval in some sense to me, like Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan, where I have literally hundreds of thousands of hours of these guys in my ear. When you first start
Yeah.
something like podcasting, you're basically copying. Like I'm listening. How does Tim Ferriss do an intro, or what are some of the questions he uses? Same thing, Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman, whoever. Insert hero to you in that situation. And recently, I've felt like in some of the things I'm doing, it's because I'm seeking that person's approval that I've never met. I've never met Tim Ferriss, never met Joe Rogan. I've heard you talk about that you haven't met Naval, at least the last time that you spoke on a podcast, which I think was a few weeks ago. But yeah, is that ever a negative for you where the inspiration and the absorption of knowledge turns into almost seeking approval, like a need for approval in a sense, where it's stopping you from being who you are in the moment? Like maybe Naval wouldn't act this way, but Eric Jorgenson would.
Yeah, Naval is an interesting one because I kind of know that he doesn't give a shit what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like there's no like I definitely cared about what he thought about this project, but I don't think that like I don't have a sense that I'd like want his approval of like me or what I'm doing as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Like I guess, and I don't think, I'm sure that he would discourage that like pattern of behavior between anybody. But yeah, I don't feel like burdened by that. I do think that like we have to be aware that anybody that we look up to or learn from is like fundamentally different from us in a ton of ways that like we probably can't appreciate, and that their lived experience and set of talents and interests and stuff is different enough that we have to know where to learn from them and when to trust our instincts or our sort of given gifts and paths and challenges, right? Like, you can learn a lot from Joe Rogan, you can learn a lot from Tim Ferriss, but like there's going to be a limit to how far you can get imitating and finding your own voice and leaning into your own interests is like where you like break out to that next level. I think once you've like mastered what they have to teach.
Yeah, I would say the first 2 years when I was podcasting, which it's about 2.5 years, the copying and imitating is super useful because I don't know what it feels like to have a good podcast come out of my mouth until I actually say some of the questions that inspire me from other people, or record an intro and look at how people are doing it and listening to all those things. And then I feel like you hit a point where it's like you were talking about, where you need to go beyond the imitation, and those foundations will always be there. You can always go back and look at someone's catalog. If you ever lose sight of where you are, you want to revisit those foundations. But then there comes a point where it's almost like a diminishing returns, where you constantly checking up on those foundations will stop you from taking a risk and doing something that maybe is not completely original, but it's different from the people that inspired you, and maybe mixing a bunch of things together and trying something new rather than going back to those sources for some sense of security.
Yeah, I think, and the more sources you have, the more influences you have, like you tend to, that's almost a proxy for originality, and the more disparate sources they are, too, like you start to really, I was reading a book about Marrakesh, which is a very strange segue, but like some of the greatest like designers and artists of their eras have like moved from Europe to Marrakesh, or at least spent enough time there, that they just had this wildly different influence and like
Yeah.
backdrop from this kind of like old world, like completely different culture that was only like, you know, an hour and a half flight away. But to like the people, their customers, their clients, you know, their audience, that influence gave them this huge differentiation, this kind of like mystique almost. And it feels like, you know, a powerful, disparate, kind of unique source or influence is just such an advantage, and such a, you know, a new combination of existing things can be worth a lot.
So these people were going
And
to Marrakesh for things that seemed unrelated, and then taking those inspirations and somehow incorporating them into their work, like the Marrakesh aesthetic somehow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Yves Saint Laurent is like the most famous example, and you know, once he had been there once, he said like, this city taught me color, and he every summer he would like live in Marrakesh, and that was like when he designed his, you know, new collection or whatever. I'm not an expert in fashion. I don't know a lot about this. I just like, I'm one article deep.
I mean,
He
you are
still
wearing
owns a house there.
you are wearing the solid black tee. It looks like, so that goes with anything. So that's pretty fashionable. That's pretty fashionably insightful on your part.
Yeah, this is the only decision I have to
You
make.
could be wearing any color pants, and all I know is that it will go with the black.
My my fashion aesthetic is Silicon Valley, which is like wrong. It is either default or wrong. Like those are my only two options. So I try to just go with default. Yeah, yeah. But I thought that was a really interesting story, and talking like him talking about how different his style was just because of that one kind of unique influence.
Is there anything that's like that for you? Like your Marrakesh, in a sense, like like some, because you do a lot of things in startups, and you do a lot of blogging. You work for Zarly, which is, it seems like it's kind of like home projects, like connecting people with others who can help build their homes and take care of these tasks. Is there anything kind of like outside of that inspires you in the work that you do that seems unrelated, but you've taken something from it and incorporated it into what you do?
Yeah, I think there's a wide. I think it depends on the lens in which you look, right? Like I really like. I'm much more of a generalist than a specialist, and I really like to read broadly and pull in a lot of different sources from all across, you know, different disciplines, different points in history, different, you know, hopefully different cultures even. And in each of those, it kind of depends. Your point of entry is different from like the point of originality, and like there's a novel piece to everyone, no matter where they're looking in. But I think like, you know, all great stories kind of start in a familiar place and take you through an unknown place and deliver you back to an original place.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something to that in storytelling. I think there's something to that in business and business model creation and products even, is that like, you know, a good product experience starts you with something you're familiar with. It takes you somewhere you've never been, and it leaves you somewhere familiar. And so I think there's, you know, that's like that is a product insight that can come from storytelling. It can come from literature. It can come from, you know, sci-fi. Like wherever you want to find that lesson, you can apply it in somewhere else. And it's, on the one hand, like a little generalized, and you have to do the work to close the gap between a general rule and a particular context that you're familiar with. But I think it's a fundamental enough insight that it can be true anywhere that people know enough about their context to be able to apply it.
Yeah, martial arts martial arts seems like a great way to apply generalism, especially mixed martial arts and things like UFC. I'm reading a book right now by George St. Pierre, who's a mixed martial arts champion, UFC champion, like one of the best fighters ever to live. And he talks about fighting in a generalistic sense, where he brings in these guys that can kick his ass in Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, Sambo, whatever it is, and in these separate specialties. But the reason he's a champ is that he can put it all together And when you're fighting in a mixed martial arts fight, when all those things are allowed, he will kick their ass because even though they're the experts in Muay Thai, he will take you down and eliminate that from your arsenal. Or if someone's better at wrestling than him, he might keep you on your feet and try to box you. And so that's really made me think about things from more of a general sense, especially creatively in podcasting, and got into Muay Thai a little bit during quarantine. And yeah, it's crazy like how many different styles can come together and kind of like start to blend. You're almost like doing math with your body a little bit. So that's something that's been an inspiration for me. I would never have thought would have affected my podcasting, and now I definitely feel myself becoming interested in different types of people to talk to, and maybe it has something to do with getting into martial arts, where it's like all this shit coming together into one thing.
I think it was interesting to watch like UFC and MMA like evolve over the last 15 years or so. Like I remember UFC started as like, well, let's see which martial art is like the strictly dominant form, and like bring in each individual expert and see like, can a Muay Thai black belt like kick the ass of a world champion like wrestler. And like that was kind of where it started. There was no MMA. There was just like specialists in each breed that they brought in to like all duke it out. And it was so interesting to see the styles change, and like they all just have kind of like melded together into like this new form, which we now like know and watch MMA, and it's almost like there's a few different styles, but it's not nearly as stark as it was, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, especially some of the earlier
Wild
fights.
West days.
Yeah, with no weight classes, you have a 165-pound jiu-jitsu guy going against a 230-pound guy who's more of like a stand-up striker. And I've seen some of those old videos where you see this guy, and I know Gracie is a huge name. I'm still kind of going through the whole jiu-jitsu world and getting more familiar with it, but I know those guys in the Gracie family kind of popularized Brazilian jiu-jitsu and were taking down these dudes that were absolutely massive using physical leverage, like basically cranking their body parts, putting them into different positions, and you would see that person and just be like, oh, that's a normal 165-pound guy walking down the street that could kill you and kill another guy who's 300 pounds because he knows how to align his bone structure in the right way to choke you out or break your arm or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was super cool. And I mean, I remember seeing Forrest Griffin like get in an arm bar and refuse to tap and get his arm broken and win the fight with one arm.
Jesus.
After like, I mean, it was just so much more like raw and wild and insane. But yeah, the Gracies were like an incredible story that came out of that. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think, is like the foundation of MMA, or at least a lot of the groundwork. But it's cool, like, I mean, judo and boxing and all this stuff come together.
Have you ever gotten into anything in that realm, like training or even? Go ahead.
I did a few months of judo, which is like really dumb because I'm enormous, and like the odds that I ever fight anybody smaller or bigger than me are like pretty low.
How tall are you?
I never. 6'6".
God damn.
Yeah.
6'6" judo. I'm trying to.
It's pretty hard to like hip throw somebody who's like 5'8" when you're 6'6", and there's like.
So judo, it's an advantage if you're smaller.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or is it like judo is designed for a smaller person to like using all the same kind of leverage points, right? Like how do you get people off balance? How do you like move their center of gravity, leg sweeps, like that kind of stuff is all, and a lot of like different groundwork.
Yeah, one of the interviews I was listening to get ready to talk with you was I think it was something with fintech. I'm blanking out, but he was a guy that you mentioned was your really good friend, Zach. I think he had the same
Zach
name.
Pettit. For fintech's sake is his podcast.
And you said, for fintech's sake, shout out to that podcast. I really enjoyed that conversation. That was my favorite conversation with you leading up to this interview. I listened to 3 or 4 going in and out, and I listened to the entirety of this conversation, and it was probably because you guys were really good friends, the dynamic between the both of you. And you mentioned that weightlifting had given you new mental models. And I feel in a similar way with weightlifting because I grew up playing baseball, played in high school and college, and had basically this framework of getting stronger built into me. So I wanted to ask for
Hmm.
you, what effect has weightlifting had on your life, whether it's purely physical or it's leaked over into other aspects? What has it meant for you to build new mental models through weightlifting?
Yeah, I mean, I basically had two kind of like main like fitness and athletic chapters in my life, and one was road crew in high school, and for the last for basically 2 years with Zach, like did a lot of lifting, and it's just so it is so helpful to see and feel like physical versions of like the compounding and the long term effort and the like daily the results of the daily grind.
Hmm.
And so I think like I can talk about some of the mental models, like that's the kind of the big picture of it. I think like with I followed a pretty like bodybuilding kind of protocol when I was doing it, and so it was like it was workouts, it was diet, it was scale, like weighing every food and like being precise to the calorie and to the down to the almond
Yeah.
of like what you were eating, which is something I had never done before, and like learning the benefits of like true precision there is kind of key. The benefits of just like recording every set, recording every meal, leaving like what it feels like to work in a system where there just isn't room for error.
Hmm.
Like when you measure and track and adhere to all of the like pre-decided inputs and outputs, like you can't mess it up, and there's no room for willpower. There's no room for like confusion or mistakes or whatever. There is just like you turn yourself into a computer. You write a program. Here's your program. Here's your workout. Here's your diet. Here's your sleep. Here's your water. Here's your vitamins. Like, do this, and then like you either did it or you didn't do it. And like, I'm not a person who's going to not do it if I decided that I'm going to do
Hmm.
it. And then once you're doing it, you're like, oh, holy shit, this works. Like, I'm definitely going to keep doing this. At that level, it's a ton of time and it's a ton of work, and it has to be like the most important thing that you're doing. But I like the chapter where you do that, like where it is the most important thing in your life, and you do see the results that come from it, makes you understand all the levers really, and like you don't, I no longer like weigh every meal and record everything, but I do 80% of what I did there, like just kind of by habit and momentum now, and it put me in a completely different place than where I was before. So I think there's something about like feel like understand where your limit is, like know what it's like to work at your absolute capacity, and put something as your absolute number one priority in life for a while and see how much you learn and how where your new default is after that, knowing that you can't do that forever, but do it for 3 months, do it for 6 months, and like see how that feels.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy how connected. It's crazy how much lifting weights has taught me about creating content because
Hmm.
weightlifting side by side with trying to develop velocity as a pitcher playing baseball, I would see, okay, if I do all the things like you were saying, on this list, check, 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 whether you feel like you wanted to do it that day or whether you could not be bothered by the weight room. If you do this, you will see improvements, and then seeing
Hmm.
that over a long period of time, and then pairing that with velocity and seeing that, okay, if I get stronger, my velocity is also going to go up. So not only am I just lifting weights because I want to look better and get stronger and be sexier or whatever your goals are, I'm also going to make myself better as a baseball player. And that was really the first skill or activity in my life where I saw, okay, you can put in these inputs into what you're doing, keep
Hmm.
adjusting those inputs depending on what's working for you, what's not working for you, going stronger certain weeks, recovering other weeks, and that all applies to something like writing a book. I assume you were able to apply some of those fundamentals to writing books, and I feel the same way in podcasting and recording audio in that sense. I feel like sticking to those inputs will you have no choice but to see long-term improvements. And then there are also kind of those valleys where you have to back off a little bit because you're feeling burnt out, and if you want to do something for 10 years, this is not the way to do it. So maybe I need to back off a little bit, so I can keep
Yeah.
doing it long term and keep myself excited about it. Okay, now maybe I'm done with that recovery period. That was like a light deloading week. Now I need to get back into it, and this is where I need to, put up some fucking numbers and actually, this is like a strength week. This is like a max week, or this is kind of a maintenance week, or this is a rest week. Like to see how that all applies to content in some sense is really cool. Looking back on my baseball career, and it sounds like for you, it's also been a source of input output recognition.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, like, this is a little bit like we were talking about before. Like, there are some lessons that, like, once you learn, you can apply it anywhere in your life, right? Like, the ideas of showing up every day and, like, doing today's work today, gets you a long way. The idea that, like, whatever you do, you got to be willing to do it for a long time, and, like, that's where the results are going to come from, is like commitment over a long period of time, and changing your expectations so that, like, you expect to get a 6-pack in a week. Like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The saying in startups is like, you overestimate what you can do in a year and you underestimate what you can do in 10 years. You look at a company like Airbnb that's actually like 11 or 12 years old. Like, that is not a long time to build a huge company. But you can't do it in a year. And I think it's the same thing with fitness. People, like, expect to be shredded in a month, and, like, you're probably not gonna be, but, like, you can be in like 10 months. And that's not a long time either. Like, when you look back at the end of that 10 months, it's gonna feel like it went by instantaneously. It might feel long while you're doing it and learning new habits and, like, struggling through some workouts, but, like, also you'll be, proud of your daily progress, and that's all you got to do is, like, do your day's work that day.
Yeah, and there's so much comparison to other people's fitness journeys. You may look in the mirror and see yourself after working out for 3 months, and you see someone else on Instagram or something, or YouTube, and you think, I'm not nearly as shredded as this person or whatever. I've been doing this for 3 months. What's going on? And then you don't realize that person's been in the gym for 5 years or 10 years, or maybe they looked like that when they were in high school because they had freak genetics. And it's like focusing on yourself and just getting to that next workout, or sometimes even that next set or rep, literally sometimes, where you're like, I've been there where you have a heavy day for squats or something, and you have 8 sets of 3, and somewhere in the middle of the 5th set, you're like, this 3rd one is not getting up the next set, maybe even the 2nd one. You literally have to, like, reset for each rep.
Every rep feels like its own set.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sometimes it's just fucking hard, but it teaches you a lot of shit.
Yeah, and in 30 minutes you'll be done and feel great.
Yeah.
You never regret a workout.
I've never regretted a workout. It's funny. I was actually I was watching this video on Jeff Bezos talking about his regret minimization framework that he used to decide whether he was going to leave his Wall Street job and start Amazon, or stay and take his yearly bonus and maybe put it off. And he used the term regret minimization, which was kind of just seemed like a fancy way to say, what am I going to least likely to regret in 50 years? And he was talking about kind of like projecting yourself forward and saying, what am I least likely to regret? Leaving my corporate job and missing out on a bonus, or not starting this online bookstore that no one thinks is a billion-dollar idea. Like and he probably didn't even think that at the time. It was just it was an online bookstore, and he was exploring the internet back in 1996. And going back to the like, I've never regretted a workout. I've started to think more in terms of that framework for bigger decisions. What thing am I going to least likely to regret? And it even works on the day-to-day basis. Like, okay, I know I've never regretted a workout in my day-to-day life. I've never regretted calling a friend. I've never regretted going for a walk without my phone. Like, even though I don't feel like doing it before, I know when it's done, evidence shows that I'm going to be in a better off place after I finish it. So I might as well just do it.
Yeah. It's surprisingly hard to remember in the moment sometimes. But yeah, it's a good way to do it.
So why do you love the Bobaverse? Because I know nothing about the Bobaverse. I was looking around online today, and it sounds like a really interesting series. And you mentioned it, so I wanted to know for you what fascinates you about. Well, first, what is it for someone who's never heard of the Bobaverse, and why does it fascinate you?
Yeah, this is. I was not ready for that question.
Neither was I.
I'm very excited to talk about it. I love. Okay, so this it's basically this is a series of, I don't know. I think there's at least 2 or 3 books now, and the first one, like the setup that happens in the first like 2 chapters, is there's like this startup billionaire who signs a agreement with a cryo company. So like if he dies, his body will be preserved. And as soon as he's like walking out of the cryo clinic, he gets like hit by a bus, and basically he wakes up like 150 years later in like his brain has been uploaded into a computer. And then something is like going terribly wrong on Earth, and that computer is like shot off. That satellite is like shot off into space with supposedly all of the like equipment that it needs to become a self-replicating like probe in space. And so he can like build his own fuel and build his own additional ships and clone himself. And it's kind of like the thought experiment of the von Neumann probe, like brought to life in basically like a lighthearted like comedy sci-fi setting. And so like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one of my favorite books, and like I just love like hilarious lighthearted sci-fi is like right in my wheelhouse. And the book reads like a movie, and it's just kind of a fun, interesting version of a thought experiment that is like I don't know, it's fun to read. It makes you curious, it makes you think, it kind of breaks your frame of like just being a human on a planet and going about your daily life.
So this guy, he gets in an accident and he finds himself uploaded into, it's like a supercomputer type thing.
Yeah, it'd be like, if instead of your body, you're now a consciousness in charge of. I mean, you can think of it almost like a real-time strategy game, right? Like you have resources and you have skills and you have talents, and you have to like go to an asteroid and find like how to make yourself more fuel, and then have to go and like figure out what to do and make more of yourself, and like make spare parts for yourself, and you can like zoom around the universe and like find sentient species, and then like figure out how to interact with them, and if you're going to, and like help. It's a very interesting. It's fun if you like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or if you like XKCD or some of that kind of stuff, like you'll probably be into this book series.
What do you feel like you get out of sci-fi? Because selfishly, I want to read and watch more sci-fi. I've never been into science fiction really from just like a broad standpoint. For whatever reason, I haven't gravitated towards it. For you, what do you mentioned thought experiments. What do you kind of get out of reading about things that may not be of this universe, but of the Bobaverse?
Yeah, I mean, like I don't think like sci-fi is inherently virtuous. Like if you're not inherently gravitated towards it or interested in it, like there's no there's no should about it. I just have always liked it. I think Ender's Game was like one of my first kind of big influences there, and like just went down that rabbit hole, and you know, more and more of them have been interesting and influential. It's somebody, I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but like science fiction is the proving ground of like the why of technology. Mm-hmm. And so you can start to think about how we would interact with something and how what problems that technology would solve or things like that, but like well before the technology can exist. And sometimes sci-fi can almost like will a technology into existence by making a great case for it. And so I think like an interesting example of this is Ready Player One. So like Ready Player One kind of fits the same category of like lighthearted, like easy to read sci-fi, near future sci-fi about virtual reality, and like a version of humanity that basically lives its entire like awake life in virtual reality. And I think that book will have a huge influence on what gets built and how, and in VR, and how quickly it gets built in VR. And I think that's a super, it's almost like intellectual headwaters of a lot of technologists. And, you know, the iPad was like talked about in Star Wars or in Star Trek. And like, there's just so much stuff that we see. It's almost like concept art for technologists. And it's fun and interesting to live in that kind of like near that line between possibility and reality. And then especially as you get to start to watch some of the technologies that you like read about in a fictional setting, like turn into reality. Like that's super, super cool.
Yeah. It's like the chicken and the egg of sci-fi. What comes first? Does the sci-fi author write about it, and then a kid reads that and wants a technology to exist so badly that he grows up and creates it? Or does that person create it and then the author writes about it, like willing something into existence? That's crazy.
I mean, it's the story of Oculus Rift, right? Like Lucky Palmer grew up reading and read Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson and was like, oh shit, I want that. Like, I think that can exist. Like, let me push on it. And like bought some components and started building them in a trailer in his parents' front yard, and like sold it to Facebook, and now we got Oculus, and like they're badass.
The guy,
it's a crazy.
The guy who invented Oculus read about it first, and then based off of that, he started fucking around and made Oculus eventually. Yeah. I'm sure that's a super general way to putting it, but that's crazy.
I mean, that's more or less. Yeah, there's a great book about Oculus. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. Let me see if I can Google it.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is a wild story. The like founding of it, the history of the future is what it's called. The history of the future. Yeah, it's about Palmer Luckey and him building the first Oculus thing, and how John Carmack, who's like this legend in the video game world and like the designer of Doom and all these other like technologies that powered all these video game enhancements, like contributed to the creation of VR. And then they like Facebook bought them, and like that's been contentious, but it continues to kind of grow. And I don't know if you tried a VR headset lately, but they are very cool.
I've tried it once. My older brother put a VR headset on my head a couple years ago, so I'm sure it's gotten way better since. Yeah. I remember not expecting myself to be as immersed as I was, because I kind of thought before I ever put on a VR headset that it's kind of like sunglasses, like you see it straight forward, but like out of the side, it's just like it's still life. It still feels like you're on Earth. And I put on the VR headset, and I was not correct. It felt like everything, whether it was a good thing or a dangerous thing, was a direct threat or opportunity right in my face. And I was like, Jesus, like this is too good. Like it's really good. And it's exciting to think about technologies like that, how good they are right now, and that hopefully we'll be alive for decades more and see how things like that pan out.
Yeah, I mean, Apple's coming out with one now. Like, I think that some of the design just leaked, and like that there should be one this year, early next year, from Apple. And like the Oculus is already definitely like cool enough. I remember trying a few years ago, and you had to like plug it into a tower to have enough compute, and now it's like just a freestanding headset and 2 controllers, and the controllers are cool and like make you feel like you have hands in virtual reality. Like it's very cool, very well done.
Yeah, it's scary to think about how it's almost going off of working out. It's almost discouraging in a sense because I'm thinking, okay, what is the point of building a good body in this reality if 20 years from now I can just be in another body in another world looking like something else? And it's that may be an exaggeration. At the same time, it's fascinating and it's scary, and it can be almost discouraging of like being able to change your reality so quickly because we invest so much into this reality, and then you can flick a button and have a different wife or have it be in a different location, or whatever it is, have different status and wealth and all things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is a very Ready Player One question, right? Like I think part of that book is a cautionary tale because we all let the real world go to shit because we are living our lives in this like virtual reality.
Is there something you read about as a kid that you wanted to turn into a technology yourself, or anything you ever dreamed about bringing into your existence, kind of like the guy who created Oculus?
I think the coolest,
or even now, reading sci-fi, anything that you want to exist.
It's another Neil Stephenson book. It's called The Diamond Age, or A Young Girl's Illustrated Primer, and it's basically like one of the technologies in there is that imagine an iPad that is like the perfect educational tool and is like deeply immersive and teaches a kid like exactly what they need when they need it in like the most engaging way possible, like through a game, such that like they're in the characters in the book. There's only like 2 of these iPads in the world, and they go to like 2 different girls in 2 very different life circumstances, and it basically their education is so good that it makes these 2 like almost superhuman, and I think that's such an interesting concept. And it's something that I think, there's no specific technology there that we don't have. It's just a design problem almost more than a technology problem. I think that's a super interesting one.
Yeah, no, that does seem pretty interesting, and I guess we'll see what the world holds in the future. Maybe someone will read it and then bring it to life.
Yeah, there's the Nexus series is another one. Those also like read like action movies, but that's basically a whole series of books about in near future about Neuralink, and like what that technology might mean for people and how we might live and fight and love, and what like spies with programmable brain hardware are like. Like that's pretty awesome.
I wanted to get back into the Naval Almanac to kind of dissect the process a little bit, because you were able to pare down, like we mentioned at the beginning, literally thousands of tweets, hundreds of interviews, and you put it all into this one resource, and you spent, I think it was 3 years and thousands of hours, I'm assuming, putting all of Naval's or whatever Naval shared publicly into this book. And that's an extremely useful thing for society, to have someone like that, their knowledge pared down into this super accessible book. You can read through it, you can dog mark it, you don't have to go through all of these different interviews. So my question is, what could someone do in the future to make it easier for someone like you to create an almanac of them? Like if there's someone now that is a content creator, what could they start thinking about now for, maybe 20 years from now, there's a kid that thinks their content is super useful. Mm-hmm. What could content creators do now to make it easier to compile what they're doing? What would, in a sense, what could Naval have done to cut your job in half? What would have made it an easier process for you? so more of these things come
Yeah.
out, like more of these almanacs of super smart people, because I think that would be a great thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, just the first answer is just to be prolific, right? Like, just put a lot out there, make it honest, make it helpful. One thing that I came across in this book is that Naval's been talking about some of the same ideas for a long time, but you can see his thoughts evolve, and you can see his phrasing evolve, and you can see new ideas come together, and like each articulation of the idea is like a little bit different. And so one of the things I was able to do with the book is look over, 5 years that he's been talking about and exploring and evolving an idea, and pick the very best instance of that, the very best articulation of that idea, and pull that out and make that, like, set that in concrete in the book, so that it's easy to find, and so that everybody can get access to the best version of that idea, and have put the best context around it, and give them the best chance of grokking that idea and taking it as their own and carrying it forward and applying it to their life. So I think if they create a lot, I think especially, the formats will change, but not being afraid to just create and productize yourself and keep that available. The only thing here that I had to ask Naval for was export of his Twitter history, because Twitter only shows you the last 3,000. But just little things like that, and being available to it. I think there's probably some value to a variety of interviewers too, and like people with good questions, like, bring stuff out of you like this. Like, I've never thought about this question before, but I think it's an interesting one, and it makes me think just a little bit differently and phrase things just a little bit differently. And like that, when you're looking at a million words of somebody, and all of their work across all this time, and trying to put together, a few hours of their very best insights they've ever had and shared, like, having somebody using different angles and different lenses and asking new questions is really, really helpful and interesting.
So it sounds like something that could be useful would be almost having some sort of flow of evolutions of ideas, where if you were talking about wealth, for instance, you could say, maybe you had a similar quote or blog post on wealth that was in the same area, and each one was more of an evolved thought process than the last. So you could have something on your site that says, hey, this is my most recent thoughts on this, or this is what I've put the most effort into.
Yeah.
This was kind of me just throwing some stuff out there and seeing if it stuck, and it did. And so I thought about that more and more and more, and this is like my highest form of this idea.
Yeah, and being as deliberate as you can about watching thoughts evolve over time. Like, things that we believed at 20, we may at 30 like understand why we believed that, and not have been wrong, but also have like an evolved version of that thought now at 30. And it's like, my past self wasn't wrong. It was just like maybe unnuanced, or maybe it is totally like reasonable and rational to just have a different belief about a specific subject at 20 than at 30 than at 40, right? And like those, back to what we were talking about, like, adults are supposed to evolve and change, and things that are, and that doesn't mean that the previous statement or opinion or belief was wrong. It was just like correct in that context, or belonged in that context, and a new belief belongs in a new context. And so being thorough about the context of ideas and beliefs, maybe, and like talking about things like why this is your stance currently, what would have to change for you to change your mind, like some of those kind of tools of thought, and second levels of how you arrived at this opinion, and where you think it might go, and how strongly held a belief is, right? This is a fundamental core belief. How well informed is it? How tested is it? How well do you understand the other side's like argument or the arguments against it? I think all of those are interesting things that help readers and people who are following along like understand whether they agree with you, whether they disagree with you, or whether that principle or thought is going to work as well for them as it maybe did for you, because everybody's context and it's different.
Yeah, context seems like it would be really important for different ideas, because you can take, I mean, podcasting is a great example. People get their clips pulled out all the time of these 15, 20-second things, and some people have ulterior motives. Most of it is positive, like people trying to help and spread information, but sometimes people take things out of context and you have no idea what that person was talking about before or what the segue was, or if they were saying, this is what I wouldn't do. And then they say something that they wouldn't do. And then like only that clip is taken out. So yeah,
Yeah.
context seems like it's super valuable to start thinking about as a creator. How can you kind of label not only the content that you're making, but also make sure that the context is readily available. So something that I wanted to ask you is, have you ever been embarrassed into making a good decision? Because Naval talks about having been embarrassed into starting his first company, and embarrassment seems like it's one of the most powerful emotions because you can sit angry for months and not do anything about it. People do that all the time. They kind of sit and boil in this anger, and or you can be happy, you can be frustrated, and people are willing to go through their days like that. But it seems like embarrassment is special because there's like this shame that you feel that you're like immediately like, get off me, like I can't like take this any longer. Is there anything that you've been shamed into doing or embarrassed into doing that was a positive direction in your life?
Yeah, I mean, my buddy Zach, that interview you listen to, like he embarrasses me into workouts all the time, and that is very effective.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I think when I was rowing, like we had a very well crafted competitive environment. I think like my coach really understood how to get the maximum effort out of like 15-year-old boys, and I think I mean, like when you stack rank people, like they want to climb, and when you show them how to climb, like and how to beat the person in front of them, like they're gonna work really hard to do it. And like that worked on me in that context. I wanted to win, and I worked incredibly hard to like beat the people I wanted to beat, and I think there's a lot of the carrot is pride and the stick is embarrassment in that context for sure. I was just watching the documentary about the Bulls, The Last Dance,
Yeah.
and Michael Jordan and a lot of that, and I kept thinking like, I know the like stoic principle is ego is the enemy, but I feel like Michael Jordan just over and over again just like used his own ego against him to make himself win, and like if there wasn't a personal reason for him to put it all out there every game, like he would just invent one. He would like invent a personal offense that somebody on the team had like committed against him and be like, now it's personal. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going all out.
Yeah.
Like over and over and over again, just like put it on his back. And that I think is psychologically hard. And like, he risked embarrassment all the time by playing that way. But I think it drastically increased his upside, and like is part of probably what made him a champion, is like learning how to use that for good.
Yeah. It seems like embarrassment is especially cold and kind of heartless in the way that it affects people. I forget what movie it is. It was kind of this like mafioso Scarface thing, but more modern. And this guy was a huge drug kingpin. And I remember he was having a conversation with his wife, and he's like, you know what, you can do. I'll accept a lot of things. Talk kind of like alluding to, infidelity or lying, things like that. But he was like, if you ever embarrass me in public, we're done. Like, if you ever do something to embarrass me, like that is the last straw above everything else. And I was like, wow, like that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, you feel. I mean, you can see strong reactions when people get embarrassed, and you feel it in yourself, right? Like you either like work to resolve it or run from it, and you're going to get a strong reaction probably either way. And it's just try to be sure you channel it for the right reasons, and like use it responsibly. I mean, in like a management context or a teaching context or something like that, you can really like scar some people, I think, if you abuse that power, or use it the wrong way, because it's a really, shame makes you shut down if you don't overcome it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, a lot of people carry a lot of that, and it's a dangerous game to play, because once it's out there, it's hard, and I think it has the possibility to maybe create a positive spiral, but it also carries the risk of that negative spiral too.
Yeah, different people can react to.
Yeah,
Different people have different reactions to the same embarrassing or shameful statement, and I I grew up getting called fat, and I was never like morbidly obese, like I was gonna die, but I was fat enough to be the fat one in the group growing up. And for me, getting called fat was part of that motivation to want to get me to work out and, be someone who's seen as attractive. And eventually baseball came into it. And I thought, okay, if I want to play in college, I need to get in better shape. But for some people, that's why I'm kind of like in between on fat shaming, because I'm like, for some people, it's an incredibly powerful tool. If I say something to one of my friends in the locker room, or he says something to me like, "Oh, looking a little flabby there," like kind of like pinches my stomach. I'm like, "All right, let's go work out or let's go run." But the same person that might like destroy their entire week. Like they may just like think about that forever and never get over it. So I'm still kind of forming my opinion on that realm of it.
yeah, and I mean, you can't know where people are going to come in, and you can't. And I don't think one. You don't have to form one opinion. You can let it sit. That it's some people can use it for good, and some people can use it for bad, and anything in the world you could say the same thing about, right?
So if you were to spend 3 years and write another almanac of a very smart, insightful person, let's say Elon Musk, for example, maybe he wouldn't be your second choice. That's up to you. What did you take, or what have you learned at a level of analyzing a human being's thought over 3 years? What have you learned outside of Naval's knowledge specifically, but in like the way that you analyze people's thoughts and compile that into a resource? What are some of those things that you would take with you on the next almanac that you wrote if you were to write one? And what are some things that you would do differently if you were to write the Elon-manac or something, the next thing? What would you do the same from last time, and what are some things that you would change up now having gone through the process?
Yeah, some things were just really hard to figure out because had never created a book like this before. A book that was entirely made out of pre-existing kind of raw material. I wasn't even sure it was possible, or if it was possible, whether it would be good. Having now done it, I feel like it is. It's a little obvious when you look at it now, and it's like all the corners are sanded and everything's like polished and stitched and seamed, and but when the first couple drafts looked rough enough that I was like, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do this the way I'm quite envisioning it. So, I mean, it's a huge weight to just know that end state is there and that it can be that good. I would definitely, I understand some things about structure and flow of ideas now that I didn't. And I just think like, the reason this book is resonating with people, and I mean it gets recommended so much and people appreciate it, is like it is one, it's dense and it's like quick to read, but you get a lot out of it. Like, I hear people say I got like a highlight on every page, and that is music to my ears. That's exactly what I want to hear. Exactly what we were going for. But I think like I read a lot of biographies, and I read a lot of biographies because I want to understand how these people think and what I can learn from them. And when you realize when you read a biography, mostly like it's just about that person and their life. And it's not a lesson. It's not about how they think. It's not about their principles. It's not about something that you can choose like to take into your own toolkit. And like, that's what this book is. This book is like Naval teaching you how Naval thinks. And like, I try to just get out of the way and give you in his own words everything that he has to teach you. And I think that there's a lot of people there's a lot more people that would be interesting to do. I think Elon Musk is a very good example. And like, if you ask yourself, I don't ask myself the question of like, what book do I want to write next? Or like, who do I want to study next? I ask the question of like, who do I want to help millions of people learn to think like?
Mm-hmm.
Like, now that I know what this book feels like to put out in the world, and now that I know what the final version is, that's what I realize that I've done, is I've helped people think like Naval. And so if you want to think like Naval, this is the best resource for it. If I want to help a million more people learn to think like somebody, like, I think Elon Musk is an awesome choice. Like, it is just like he's pulled the future into the present in 4 different ways that are like, you can love him or hate him for 1,000 different reasons, and they're valid, but like, you can't deny the impact on humanity that he has had and will have. He's only like, I don't think he's even 50. Like,
Yeah.
That's insane.
And everything.
So ask myself that question. Like, that's a good one.
Yeah. A lot of people associate Elon Musk with first principles because it seems like he's so good at thinking about problems and then kind of eliminating other people's depictions of them or how other people have solved them in the past, and then saying, can we do this according to the laws of physics? And if we can, then why are we not trying to do it this way? If it's more cost effective, if it's better, if it's...
Yep.
And even something as simple as podcasting, you can apply that to. Like, podcasting, the only thing you need for a podcast is audio, and you need to upload it into a server that will distribute it. And so that has taken the form of people sitting on couches and having 2 cameras and a wide angle and kind of like the prototypical podcast setup, which I've done myself when I have more in-person podcasts. People are sitting on the couches behind me. But sometimes I think about like, what if no one ever recorded a podcast before, how would I, and I've never watched a podcast, never listened to a podcast, how would I have that conversation? Like, what is the most effective way to translate what that person's trying to say into this medium of audio and video? And Elon Musk has certainly affected my thinking with something as, simple as podcasting, when he's, 100 light years ahead of me thinking about how to get to Mars and launch rockets. I'm like, oh, how can I, apply first principles to podcast? But like, it's kind of, you can really apply it to anything. So I definitely think he would be a great person.
I mean, that's what's awesome. That's what's awesome about him, is like, no matter what you're doing, he's an inspiration for you to do it better and faster. I think, like, at least that's what a lot of people, I think, follow him for,
Yeah. And he's also a great example of how he's an example for me of how much extra energy I put into deadlines sometimes that are unnecessary. Like, deadlines seem so black and white, where if you hit it, it'll be a success, and if you miss it, it'll be a failure. But he's proven time and time again that if you deliver on something close to what you said you were going to deliver, or at least people can connect the dots and see a path to what you said you could deliver, then people are willing to accept you missing a deadline or 3 because you said, I'm going to do this in a year and it took you 4. People are willing to... Deadlines aren't as much of a hard predictor of success to other people as they seem to ourselves. And so sometimes I remind myself, like, I need to get this podcast out tomorrow, but it's not going to be as good because I'm not done editing it, and I still have to do all this other stuff for my job. And I'm like, what if I do it on Thursday instead of Wednesday? Like, I put out a better podcast a day later. I think people are going to be willing to accept that.
Yeah, it's a good, especially when that podcast is going to live on for years, right? Like, what's one day? But funny, the other thing that I think Elon Musk is semi-famous for is like pushing schedules, and it's ironic in the context of like he misses all the deadlines, but also he makes anybody go faster than anybody ever thought they could, right? And so they were like, the Boring Company story or whatever, that's like, we think we can start digging next month once we figure the permitting process out and once we get the drill, and he's like, how about you start digging in an hour and you see how big you can get the hole by Sunday night, like ready, go.
Yeah. That was when he basically told everyone to go in the parking lot, right? They went outside.
Yeah, like start moving cars. Yeah, here's a shovel.
There you go. Screw the deadlines, or screw what you think is possible.
Yeah, which is he's done a number of things that were like considered that were like not against the laws of physics, but like considered impossible timeline wise and schedule wise and complexity wise, by the current pace of industry. And it's that combination of like instinct for speed and like getting started, and the first principles piece of like, if it's not against the laws of physics, then I'm trying it. Right.
So something that I promised we would get into is sandwiches. What do you find fascinating about sandwiches? You post about them a lot, and I would like to know what it is that sparks your interest in the sandwich.
I just love a good sandwich. I mean, I can give you the like sandwiches, like, there's sandwiches in every culture, and like, you can get a sandwich at a steakhouse or a sandwich at a, food cart, and like, there's a million different versions of it, and every sandwich is unique, but like, I just fucking love a good sandwich. It's just a meal in your hand, and you got salt, fat, acid, heat, all the different like contrasts, textures, and flavors. And like,
what makes a good sandwich? What are the defining characteristics of a good sandwich to you?
Those are the things you need contrast across flavor and contrast across texture. And if you can get temperature, I personally think that's ideal as well. But there's exceptions to be had there. But if you get like all the great sandwiches, you tend to see contrast. You see a fat and an acid, or you see like a creamy mozzarella and like crunchy lettuce. Like it's just about the contrast and like hitting like all the flavor, all the parts of your tongue in one bite.
So there is a yin and a yang to the art of sandwich making.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a particular type of sandwich that's your favorite?
I'm partial to like a classic Italian. Like if I could only eat one ever again, like that would be it. But I really have not met many sandwiches that I wasn't extremely happy to eat.
Yeah. I love sandwiches. My taste in sandwiches has sadly devolved over the years because I haven't made as many. So I'll eat a peanut butter and jelly or something, and I'll be like, oh, this is a great sandwich to me. But I need to get back into the sandwich game. Peanut butter and jellies are great, even just peanut butter. But I've been out of the sandwich game for some time now, and you are inspiring me to get back into my love of sandwiches.
Yeah, I mean, if my Twitter thread of my sandwiches eaten can't get you motivated and back in the kitchen, it's not complicated. Like, I believe you can do it, and you'll be happy you did.
I had a couple questions as we end off that may be too deep, but we'll see. How
if you got to ask, they're too deep.
Yeah, they're way too deep, and we'll get into it anyway. How has your view of love evolved over the past few years? And it could be whatever that means to you. It could be romantic love. It could be just friends on a connected level. But what are the biggest ways in which your view of love has changed over the years?
I think at some point you graduate from thinking about love as like just a, what makes me happy personally, into like, I'm now like building a family.
You are, like, you're saying you're now building.
Yeah, this is a thing that happened over somewhere in the past few
Hmm.
years. Like your first, but I think that in general, like your first relationships, are you figuring out like what works for you as a person? But eventually, the way I summarize this, to my friends is like, you don't get to choose your mother, but you get to choose your son's mother.
It's a good one.
And I think that that is definitely like a phase shift that happens as you just kind of change context, right? And like learn to think about relationships a little bit differently.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, my the way that I view love has changed with the way that I view cool, because I'm always going to gravitate towards people that I think are cool, and what that means to me changes in different contexts, whether it's, someone who, like when you're in college, you want that like free spirited girl who you're like, oh, like, she doesn't give a fuck about anything, and like she's so cool, and like she's into all these different things, and like she's kind of like a free spirit. And I think a lot of people are kind of like that in college, and then you get older, and for me at least, I've seen a lot. I've thought more about the practicalities of love on a day by day basis. Like, how is this person treating me? How am I treating them? What's the small things? As cliche as that is, like what are the things that we're doing to each other that are either, making our life better together or making our life worse? And yeah,
Yeah. Wait, but why has this awesome article that's most of life is just like a boring Tuesday, is what he calls it. So like your relationship isn't defined by your best moments or your worst moments. It is mostly like your boring Tuesdays. So like, how does it feel on a boring Tuesday?
how does it feel on a boring Tuesday? Yeah, I mean, that applies to relationships, and it also seems like it applies to careers too, because I'm sure, I've definitely, I've definitely had some people who have wanted to get into podcasting and kind of like trying to pick my brains on what it takes to start a podcast. And a lot of the things that I find fascinating about doing the research and doing the editing and whatever these seemingly menial tasks are, I've managed to find a way to make them exciting, or maybe they're naturally exciting to me. Whereas someone else is like, oh no, I just want to like record the conversation and kind of, pass that off to someone else. So I definitely feel like most of what I'm doing with podcasting is so boring to watch. It's literally the most boring thing ever. I'm sitting at a computer looking at audio waves, and I'm trying to edit them and uploading them and splicing the content for social media. But like in my mindset, I'm like, this is the most exciting thing ever. Like, I can't wait to release all this content. This is good shit. So applying to love, I can see that kind of
Yeah.
crossover where maybe it looks boring. You're sitting with someone on the couch. You're not saying anything to each other. Maybe one person's reading and the other one is, talking on the phone or whatever, but it just works for whatever reason. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, if there was someone who had read everything you ever wrote, listened to every podcast you ever recorded, read all the books you read, consumed all the same content as you, if that person existed, what is there in your life that's influenced you that that person wouldn't see? So, in other words, the hidden influence that drives you. Maybe it's not in the content, maybe it's not in the things that you've consumed, but it's something there that in the background has been a source of action or inspiration throughout your life.
That's a very good question. I think I think that would just be like some of like the culture of my family and like how I was raised and my parents' values. I think that's like it's one of those things that's like it just kind of feels like water, like it's just in all of us, our own version of that, and it comes out in ways that it partly defines who we are, but we rarely like articulate what those things are or like talk about them specifically as stuff that we've learned because
Mm-hmm.
it's just like in us for as long as we can remember. So I think that those are always like interesting questions and things to think about. And some of my favorite conversations with people is like, what were like the norms in your house or the habits in your house, or like what are the things that you did at your family that like you loved or hated and you'll definitely do or not do, with your kids.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that I haven't put deep thought into that over quarantine, and I was in solo quarantine for a bit, so naturally your thoughts start to wander to whatever, and a lot of that is kind of these childhood experiences. So I'm slowly starting to realize how much my parents have shaped me in a way that is responsible for better or worse the outcomes, some of the outcomes that I'm experiencing now. So I'm there with you in terms of analyzing that stuff.
Yeah.
I-
Yeah. That's a good question. I like that one.
Yeah, I stole it from so speaking going all the way back to unoriginal ideas. I think it might have been Tyler Cowan. I don't know if you've listened to his podcast
Uh,
Conversations with Tyler. He has a blog Marginal Revolutions. I keep a running list of all these podcast questions that I find interesting. So it's kind of just like this clusterfuck on my phone of going back 2.5 years. And yeah, I guess that's kind of like a
that's
good
a good,
example.
it's a good file to
I think,
have. Like that makes for good dinners. That makes for good. Yeah.
yeah, it's I. What makes me keep that, or not what makes me keep that list, but something I think about is like I'm always scared of someone putting me on the spot for a podcast for some reason. Like I've had a recurring dream where someone's like, "Oh my god, like we don't have a host for this podcast. Can someone here like host it?" And I'm just like, "Yeah, I got this thing on my phone. Like I got a list of all these questions that apply in a general manner to different people. I can ask them right here."
Is there a doctor and a podcast host on this plane, please?
Yeah, exactly. We need someone to interview the man who is having a heart attack to get his view on suffering. But yeah, thanks again for taking the time to hop on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and your work has influenced me, and I'm going to steal things from Naval Almanac. I'm going to steal things from the Evergreen blog, from the other podcasts you've been on, and give credit. And yeah, I appreciate what you do, and you're definitely making me think more like Naval with the Naval Almanac, and also like yourself with the blogs and podcasts that you have been a guest on. So I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Zach. Honestly, it means a lot. Appreciate it, and hearing that it's helpful is fuel to keep going. So I appreciate it.
Awesome.